Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We welcome you to our newest Transylvania Lectures event. The topic for this evening is tracing the legacy of civilizations, and our big question today will be, will our past define our future? Culture and civilization are complex but very important concepts in understanding human progress throughout history. We all know that learning from our previous experiences and mistakes is a very efficient way to improve ourselves, so one can think that examining historical experiences to improve modern society can be just as important. Our guest speaker, Dr. Michael Bonner, is a historian and government relations consultant. He has a decade of federal and provincial political experience, having served a total of 6 ministers in 8 portfolios within Canadian federal and provincial governments. His previous books dealt with aspects of the history of ancient Iran, one of which is a narrative history of the Sasanian dynasty entitled The Last Empire of Iran. His most recent book is In Defense of Civilizations, How Our Past Can Renew Our Present. His speaking partner tonight will be Dr. Raluca Moldovan, Associate Professor at the Department of International Relations and German Studies at Babes-Bolyai University. She has a PhD in history with a thesis on the representation of the Holocaust on film. She has also published numerous scholarly articles on topics ranging from history to mass culture and international relations in many Romanian and international journals. Enjoy.
Thanks very much for that introduction. The topic today, I wanted to sort of set it up with a bit of a taste of what I had to say in my book, In Defense of Civilization. Don't be fooled by the title. It has nothing to do with fighting or defending something literally. It's more it's best construed as more like a defense of the concept, that it is still, I think, a useful concept, a useful word, despite many decades now of people trying to either dismiss it or to suggest that it isn't even a unitary concept, that there are sort of several different distinct civilizations, which is potentially a true idea, but I wanted to confront what it was that they all had in common. And of course, you can't really do that unless you can answer the question, what is civilization? A famously difficult one, in fact, one which may actually be impossible to answer, at least to define it sort of abstractly. Although many people have tried, I don't think that any of the abstract definitions really hold together very well. Depending on what your native language is, you may have a different word for civilization. You may have a different way of expressing it. In English, the word is actually a new word. It isn't attested, for instance, in the first English dictionary composed in the late 18th century. The concept was expressed with words like civil or contrasted with something like savage or barbarous, that sort of thing. And of course, in the ancient world, despite the fact that the word civilization in English looks like it's Latin, the ancient world didn't have this word. They had the same concept, but they spoke more of cultivation, both in the sense of cultivating knowledge as well as in the sense of agriculture or raising animals and so forth, and hence also the concept of tameness, that both animals and people could be considered tame. I have a slightly more expansive idea of it, and I want to take you back in time in order to discuss it through a little bit of myth, a little bit of legend, story, and a lot of art. Because I think that telling the story of the emergence of what we call civilization can only really be grasped if you look far back in time to a point long before there was anything that could be called civilization. Now, of course, the founding sort of story of the Christian religion, I think, has something to tell us about this transformation, the story of the fall, the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. I think it's telling us something about the transition of one mode of life within historical time to another. And of course, embedded within that story in Genesis, if you recall, there is a reference to agriculture, that after Adam and Eve leave the garden, they are condemned to work the land and to sweat and toil to get their living, whereas before they didn't. There was some different mode of life. And of course, not long after that narrative is finished, we have the construction of the first city in the story of the Tower of Babel, which, if you remember the story, it's looked on very unfavorably and comes to a really rather a bad end, which I think tells us something about the challenge and the struggle of sedentary life. So embedded within this story, within this much sort of mythologized story of our very ancient past, we have both the concept of living in a single place and building a city out of brick, and we also have the story of agriculture. Okay, you've probably heard a version of this from anthropologists as well in a sort of non-religious, non-mythological context. But what I'm going to tell you is that despite there being some truth to this general sort of story of the rise of agriculture and cities and so forth, that it isn't actually the full story, and there is much more to it. And what I'm going to tell you is that the concept of a stable, sedentary, sort of permanent settlement for human beings is actually far older than what we consider to be the first cities, or what are traditionally regarded as the first cities. And it's also far older than agriculture, which means that the concept of civilization actually comes first. And it was when mankind realized that there was a place to settle and to live permanently that gave rise to agriculture, not the other way around. That is what I'm going to tell you. Now, how do I know this, or what business do I have telling you this? Well, think about something as seemingly straightforward as art, or the creation of material culture. It long predates what we call civilization. This is an example here from the Upper Paleolithic period, beginning as long ago as 50,000 years, coinciding with the last ice age. Now, people didn't live in caves, but they painted in caves. They may have painted elsewhere too. They may have painted outside. They may have painted things on animal hides. Unfortunately, if they did, we don't know, because none of it survives. What does survive, apart from a handful of examples of material culture and carvings and so forth, are paintings in caves. Not only are they in caves, they're very deep within caves. They're in the most inaccessible, the remotest part of caves, which is very strange. Why did they do that? Well, we may never know. But I think we can get a sense of the kind of worldview that people had when they did this by looking at the art, and then we can contrast it with the kind of material culture that comes after, in the period that we call civilization, and that this will give us a good idea of the kind of change that has occurred. So look closely at the paintings, at the art. These are lions sort of superimposed on one another. The heads of lions, they often seem unfinished. So something is missing. They're sort of, it's almost like you're watching a herd sort of move forward very quickly, but the whole I think that the energy and the movement have been captured, but the whole image is not there. Here's another example. And another. This is a sort of zoom out of the same image of the lions from before. Bison. And here's a carving of one. And here's an example of the famous hands. Curiously, the hands are not put on like this, they're actually put on like that, which is, I think, kind of counterintuitive. They're putting the back of the hand on and then blowing paint on it. So I don't know about you, but what I see in these images, I see vigor, movement, energy, vitality. The artists have clearly studied the subjects carefully. They're lifelike, almost realistic. There's certainly an appreciation for the figures that they represented. But much is missing, I think. There are no groups of people. There are no horizons or sort of landscapes or natural settings. The images seem to sort of float. In fact, many of the images are, as you saw, they're incomplete. They don't have hooves, and they just sort of seem to be hovering there in no particular context. No plants and no symbols of time. There's no sun, moon, stars, or anything that could be construed as an obvious depiction of seasons or something like that. Now, obviously, there's the survivorship bias. Maybe they painted these things on hides and they all failed. They all decayed over the years. I doubt it. This is a sort of an uninterrupted history of painting, or seemingly uninterrupted, for tens of thousands of years. It's most remarkable that nothing depicting these things have survived. And I think that it tells us a great deal about a concept of time, or perhaps even the absence of a concept of time, and not necessarily the absence of a concept of space, but one that had not completely developed, if that makes sense. Now, we've not seen any human figures, but I'm going to show you one. When human beings appear, they look awful compared to the animals. Not only does this strike me as not a particularly attractive image of a man, it's hidden away in the so-called shaft of a sort of remotest part, the sort of rearmost part of a cave, and you have to go down the shaft or sort of be lowered down into it even to see it. The light that you see reflecting off it is actually misleading because it would have been completely dark. So, I think that tells you something about people's views of themselves in this period. Here's another very famous example. In fact, the example is so famous, it's been photographed and traced so many times that it has almost worn away. But this sort of sketch on the other side is a recreation of what it once looked like when it was fresh. This is clearly a human being dressed up with some kind of antlers, maybe the face of a deer, perhaps. Looks like the tail of maybe a cat or something. People have inferred that this represents a shaman or some kind of sorcerer, somehow connected with Paleolithic religion, but not really cutting a very good figure for a human being, I would say. And similarly here, you have the famous lion man figurine. Clearly a man, but with the head of a lion. And this other rather peculiar image, scholars think that it depicts the sort of lower legs of a woman with the pubic triangle, and then there's no more of the woman, there's the head of a bison and a lion. This sort of jumble of images. There's there's nothing that would resemble what you might call a portrait or an idealized vision, such as we would recognize and relate to of mankind. And now I think that this, again, it's hard to put into words exactly what you would think this represents. I interpret it to mean that there's a sense of permanence that's missing. The world is still very much in flux. It's one of constant movement and energy and vitality, in which animals figure very prominently, but mankind's role is somehow undeveloped or uncertain. And I think that this is what you would expect from hunter-gatherers, from people who are constantly on the move. Perhaps these caves were places where some kind of annual or regular religious rites occurred or something. But otherwise they would be constantly moving around in search of game and so forth, moving with the seasons, having no fixed or permanent relationships with the land or with other people over long distances. That's what I think I see. All of this suddenly changes, though. In terms of historical time, the change is very sudden, and it comes right at the end of the Ice Age. Now, this site here, this is an archaeological site in southern Turkey. It's called Boncuklu Tarla. Excavation on it has just begun, and it is much older than all the other sites and the nearby, and all the other sites were already very old, extraordinarily old. This is 12,000 years ago, so the Ice Age had practically not even finished. It was still sort of fading out. This is a structure. It's a permanent structure. It looks something like it could be considered a sort of proto-city, a very early permanent establishment that was set up and endured for a couple of thousand years. Now, of course, it's been newly discovered. It's not as well studied as the other ones. I'll give you an example of another one that is almost as old, that is very well known. It's called Göbekli Tepe. This looks, to all intents and purposes, like a public shrine or a communal shrine that was set up long before agriculture, long before cities, long before the first states. And it looks like there were little houses or permanent dwellings that were set up around it. You see these sort of standing stones in it, sort of vaguely reminiscent of Stonehenge, perhaps. Here's another view. This is a possible reconstruction by an artist, give you a sense of what it might have looked like as it was being built. If you zoom in on some of these large standing stones, you see this kind of stuff. In fact, when this was discovered, nobody had any sense of how old it was, because they thought that this art couldn't possibly be anywhere near as old as, say, the art of dynastic Egypt or Mesopotamia. They thought it might be some kind of later medieval gravestone or something like that. But that turned out to be completely wrong. You have these sort of strange vulture-headed figures holding, it looks like they're holding these round balls. And what this is believed to represent are perhaps totem animals or something holding skulls, because this was a site of, as far as we can tell, it was the site of ancestor worship, that skulls were preserved there and perhaps visited annually or regularly for some kind of communal ritual. And exactly what the vulture-headed things represent, we're not entirely sure, but this is probably somehow connected with the ritual that went on there. Now, the concept of ancestor worship, which seems to be the consensus as to what's going on here, this is a fundamental shift from the idea that people are constantly on the move, or they're sort of the world is in flux, and mankind has no particular permanent dwelling. This is a representation of the idea that there's a sense of common ancestry, of a shared sort of common ritual around which people might actually be living, or that they might frequent during part of the year. An idea of permanence and stability is beginning to take shape. This is another site, a later site. This is what people call the world's first town. It's at a site called Çatalhöyük, also in Turkey and Anatolia. Very well excavated. It's been worked on since the 60s. And you can see these little holes, these square holes and so forth. This is what it probably looked like. As you can see, there are no streets, so everybody had to walk around on the roofs of houses, apparently. And this is actually quite an idealized picture, because a lot of the archaeological evidence suggests that the areas just immediately outside the houses and around them, they're just full of rubbish. People were constantly throwing their waste out there, so it probably wouldn't have been very pleasant to live in for us. But nevertheless, this was the world's first town, they say. Maybe 7,000 persons live there. I live in a town that has roughly 9,000, so I think, probably have a good idea what it was like to live there. Big enough for anonymity, but small enough that you might know most people you live near. Here's a reconstruction of what it looked like inside one of the houses. These bull's heads, they're often thought to represent some kind of family shrine, and there are other elements found in the houses that people construe to represent hunting trophies, or sort of perhaps heirlooms, symbols of family history that are passed down over a long time. And then, of course, there are these hearths, these fireplaces. Now, the reason this is significant is that the evidence suggests that every couple of generations, every maybe 50 to 100 years, maybe a little bit more, these houses would be completely stripped inside. Everything was taken out. Even the art was taken off the wall, and then put back exactly as it was, in exactly the same place, over and over and over again, every couple of generations, for over the course of about 1,000 years. So this is another representation of stability, permanence, and something that you might even call a sense of tradition. That there's some proper way that a house ought to look. There's some, family history, heirlooms, hunting trophies, and so forth that get passed down and then get put back, taken out, perhaps cleaned, put back exactly as they were, predictably and in a sort of stable pattern over 1,000 years. This is an example of some of the art that you find in the houses. It's been touched up a little bit so it looks a little bit more clear. These are the little houses. They look like television sets. A symbol of sort of order and stability and permanence. And this is a nearby hill or a mountain. Looks like it has maybe a volcano or something. So this is what people thought of the first house they lived in. Now compare this image of people hunting a pig to the Paleolithic images. Instead of that sense of movement and flux, you have one gigantic pig with all of these little people going around it hunting. They have bows and arrows. I think maybe one or two of them, one of them looks like he has an axe. I think there might be one with a spear. But look at this guy here. He's holding what people seem to think is a drum. So, bearing in mind that this pig is depicted as sort of far too large to actually be realistic, what we have here is a scene of people actually cooperating and doing something together. they're hunting. Some are chasing the pig down, others are trying to surround it, and then one of them is beating the drum to maybe keep spirits high or to frighten the pig or something. But there's nothing like this that we've found in Paleolithic art. There's no sense of a group cooperating in any kind of particular common purpose or anything like that. And this is one of the first images that shows us that. Here's another one. Also a sense of movement and cooperation and so forth. And these guys with their little loin cloths, they look like leopard skins, I think. I think they're meant to be leopard skins. This implies that someone is hunting and making leopard skins for them. So you have a sense of a wider sort of social network and maybe something approaching division of labor. But it's, again, the same kind of concept of cooperative effort and something akin to a social social existence, which you don't find in Paleolithic art. Now, as an aside, I will say, I think that Paleolithic art is actually much more beautiful than this kind of stuff. I think it's much more attractive to look at, but this is telling a completely different kind of story. And in fact, the mere fact that it is telling a story is something that is also new. So I don't think that there's that sense of narrative in the older art. There are sort of momentary images of energy and movement, but not a story. A little bit more about Çatalhöyük. The cult of ancestors still seems to be going strong here. People are living in these houses that we saw, and they're burying their ancestors right under the house. There's no sort of separate cemetery or graveyard that people are going to. They're burying everybody right below the house. And as far as we can tell, what they did after a certain point is they would remove the heads of their ancestors, they would decorate them and keep them inside their houses. Now, this seems kind of odd by our standards, but to them, it meant that same sense of continuity, connection with the past, sort of closeness to the land in which they and their ancestors had always lived, and a sense of not just your own ancestors, but that you share ancestors with others. That there's a sort of like a common sense of ancestral ties to the place in which they're living. There's one scholar. I don't even know if he's really a scholar. Maybe more of what you would call a crackpot. But his idea was that people saved the heads because they thought that their ancestors were talking to them and they were hallucinating voices. I don't think that that's true, but it's an idea that's out there that you might encounter. Sounds a little crazy to me, but ancestor worship is what seems to have taken place. And I'm not trying to suggest that the ancestor worship is what caused this. It's more that the ancestor worship represents the sense of connection to a community and to a specific place. Okay, this develops further as we go through time. The first great properly sedentary civilization with a well-developed state and so forth. It's usually thought to be ancient Egypt, and I cannot mention the word Egypt without showing you at least one pyramid. So here are 6, and art of the early dynastic period has taken yet another shift. So not only do we have this sense of permanence and stability that is actually quite older, very much older, because we see it in the period before states, before agriculture. We also see a different vision that has taken shape here. Look at these faces, both of sort of aristocratic persons, civil servants, and just ordinary household, people going about ordinary household tasks. It's obviously idealized. I'm not trying to pretend otherwise, but the ideal is very clearly one of rational people going about, their appointed tasks cheerfully, calmly, and it's a vision of permanence and stability. Here are some other examples here. I like these scribes, these government officials falling over each other, trying to take down whatever they're being told. Some other ones. And these are very early. Obviously, Egyptian art is very stereotyped and it stays sort of roughly the same through a very, very long period of time. But these are, I've deliberately selected very early examples. And here you have a king and his son, and this sort of beautiful exposition of these names. These are all names. Often you will find that the images of the kings within tombs, they also have inscriptions that sort of tell a historical story or narrate something that the person did. You have evidence here of the narrative power of art being combined with that of language, which is a new thing. Let's just pause here for a second. I want to emphasize, in case I'm getting too carried away with Egyptian stuff, that by now we have the full development of agriculture. By now we have a concept of a state. By now we have domestication of animals and so forth. All of that was either non-existent or very rudimentary in the examples from Çatalhöyük, that the hunter-gathering economy is still going strong when all of that has taken shape. People have already settled down, and they've settled down before agriculture. All of this stuff comes long after. Between Çatalhöyük and the ancestor worship and the early wall art and Egypt, you have a good 5,000 years. So this is just to emphasize that the shift toward an agricultural mode of life and domestication of animals and so forth, it's something that is actually enabled by civilization, and it's not the other way around. Okay, just a few more points. It's not just Egypt, it's also Mesopotamia. This is the ruins of a ziggurat. Not very impressive looking now, but at one point it probably was. Mesopotamian art also tells the same story. And it's in Mesopotamian art that you find the very first horizon in Western art. It's on this so-called Uruk vase, or some people think Uruk should be pronounced Warka, take your pick. But here, horizon, almost the effect of a comic strip with these different registers on the vase, and as you turn it around, it's almost like you're seeing these animals and figures walking in different directions. The vase itself is probably about this high. It was used in the ritual that seems to be depicted here, as far as we can tell. There's the image of two other registers. But the idea of the horizon and the sort of the flat lines framing the images, this is the first example of essentially representing things in a particular place, standing on the ground. Again, the sense of stability and rootedness has clearly taken full shape. This is another example from the so-called Standard of Ur, a little bit later than the other one. People also standing on the ground and going about their business. The Standard depicts, it has two sides to it, one depicting war, one depicting peace. This is the war side, hence the chariots and the horses and the people who seem to be in armor and so forth. And the peace side. So again, you have this vision of people going about their business in a kind of orderly fashion, warfare, and farming. It looks like maybe a priest or a king sitting there with he's got a cup, he's having a drink, relaxing, and symbols of agriculture. Mesopotamian art is much more various than Egyptian art. Egyptian art is very stereotyped. But even here you find this is a bureaucrat, a scribe, ready to serve the king, looking happy to be at work. I think there's still some sort of mystery as to what these things are with the big eyes, these early sort of figurines. Again, the same guy who thought that the skulls were talking to people over hundreds of years, he thinks that these are also evidence of people hallucinating, talking, and that the big eyes sort of helped focus people. I think that that's probably wrong. But again, you have a very different vision of mankind's view of himself here in comparison with the Paleolithic images, even though these may look a little bit weird to us. Now, in my book, which you can find in all fine bookshops everywhere, or even on Amazon, I identify 3 results of civilization because I want to, over the course of the book, I want to sort of compare different ones, and I thought it would be useful to have 3 rubrics. These are not causes, they are results. So if I look at early dynastic Egyptian art or the art of Mesopotamia, I sum up what I see with clarity, beauty, and order. And some of these are more straightforward than others. By clarity, I mean that it's sort of the opposite of what we see in Paleolithic art, that the world seems much easier to depict and straightforward, unambiguous, and literally clear, that we no longer have images superimposed on one another in a sort of strange jumble. It's very clearly set out and easy to interpret, and it's intelligible to us. By beauty, I don't mean that it's physically attractive, although I do think that a lot of early art is. What I mean is beauty in the sense of proportion, harmonious proportion. English doesn't really have a good word for this. Your language may. If so, please let me know what it is, and maybe I'll borrow it. But this idea that images express a sort of, that they can be expressed mathematically in proportions. The so-called Egyptian canon. If you think about the stereotyped images, there's a certain ratio in expressing the relationship between the size of the head and the torso and the arms and the body and then the legs to the rest of it. And this held good for thousands of years. It was tweaked here and there, but it was more or less the same for a very long time. And we inherited it also, although nowadays we tend not to use it. And then the sense of order. The sense of order can take shape in images of political authority or religious authority. And, if you think about that vase, you have sort of these literal orders of the priests and then the people serving the temple and then the animals and the grain and plants growing. That is an expression that there's a kind of orderly pattern to the universe taking shape, as I say, both in politics and perhaps also in religion. Those of you who are curious what my book looks like, this is the cover. And of course, it's not just Mesopotamia and Egypt, it's also Persia and Assyria. I'm actually a historian of Iran by training, so the book is pretty heavy on Persia, if you're interested in that sort of thing. And I'll just leave you with a final thought. Look at this vision of an orderly, stable, peaceful government with this sort of calm and settled king with his perhaps an advisor or maybe a priest coming up respectfully to, I don't know, say hello or tell him something. This is from the Persian throne room in the palace of Darius at Persepolis, and it's arguable that this vision of sort of civilized stability and permanence and so forth takes within the ancient world its sort of finished form in this. And I'll take you right back to the beginning and show you what a contrast this is with one of the earliest images of the human form, and it really gives you a sense of how far we came since the Ice Age. But that's embedded within all of that. I think that's where we can look for what the meaning and the origin of civilization is. So maybe there are questions or rebuttals or something, but that's how the book opens, and that's my sort of sense of what civilization means.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
For this very interesting, scintillating expose about the beginnings of civilization. Listening to you, I immediately thought of about 3 questions. But first, I would love to give the opportunity to our audience tonight to address a few questions to Dr. Bonner. So if you have questions, comments, curiosities, anything like that, please express yourselves.
And of course, it doesn't have to be on, cave paintings. Those are only at the beginning of the book. The book does go further forward in time, right up to the present moment, in fact.
Yes, it does. I can attest to that. I looked through it this morning. So, who would like to break the ice? Yes, we have a question from over there.
Hi, good evening. I just wanted to get some clarification on the notion that agriculture did not precede civilization, but rather civilization preceded agriculture. And so if that is your take, are you suggesting then that civilization is not a result of no longer being in a survivalist mode? Can you expand a little bit on that and where exactly man sees himself in light of this transition? Sorry if that's
Yes.
a little bit too convoluted.
So
Thank you.
what I want to say is that the old idea of an agricultural revolution that then compelled everybody to settle down is wrong. And that's not just my own idea, it's just no longer a widely accepted one, but it's still commonly repeated. And I think one of the reasons that it's repeated is that we really want to think of ourselves as having advanced through time, through history, through technology. And I want to reject that idea, which is not to say that I don't like technology or it's somehow bad, which it sometimes is, but not always. But it isn't because of technology that we ended up where we are, or at least not exclusively. There clearly is an interaction there, which I also explore later in the book. But we didn't settle down and develop a sense of permanence because of some kind of economic system or mode of production, the way the Marxists say. It's more that we developed things like the state or the sort of settled narrative quality of art and the amenities of civilization because we developed that sense of permanence and the need to settle down. Now, you could then say, well, where did that come from? And I have to admit, I don't actually have an answer for that. It must come from some development that occurred over the course of the Ice Age or immediately after. I'm not enough of an anthropologist to speculate. I'm sure someone has, but at some point it took root, it took shape, and it developed from there. And again, the emphasis is that if you think about the present day, there are people who think, and I think all of us have pursued this mode of thought at some time, that the solution to our problem is some piece of technology, or if only we could develop a certain different economic system, X, Y, or Z would be better, or if only if only the AI renaissance came now, we could all flourish better. That mode of thought is a new one that isn't really attested far back in the past, and that a lot of that if you think that way, it obscures the fact that non-material and you might even say philosophical or even religious ideas have driven mankind forward in history, perhaps even more than any particular piece of technology has.
All right. Anyone else? Yes. Another question.
So one thing I noticed that in the 7000 BC art, there wasn't order or hierarchy wasn't represented in any way, but already in Egyptian art there is presence of it.
Yeah.
But I still assume that there must have been some kind of order even in 7000 BC society. So question is, did it exist? I assume the answer is yes, but how did it find its way into art? What's your take on that?
That's a good question. I agree with you. There are people, though, who have argued that the evidence from a place like Çatalhöyük suggests no government, a kind of absence of a state, and a kind of like anarchy in a favorable sense, like a lot of hippies would have, when it was excavated in the 60s, I think a lot of people assumed that this was some other form of social and political order that we moderns could pursue, because I think they thought it was more natural and that our method of organizing ourselves was unnatural. However, there are people, first of all, who still exist in this world who adopt one mode of social order for half the year and then another one for the other half. So they could be very sort of rigidly hierarchical in the winter time and then not in the summer. There are some, and this kind of thing always gets omitted. Maybe it was like that at Çatalhöyük. We can't eliminate that possibility. But was there government? There's no seemingly obvious evidence. There's no obvious evidence of government, but there's also no evidence of what you would call equality. Each house is a little bit different. Some have more trophies, more art, more hunting depictions and so forth than others. So there's clearly some sense that there are differences among people, but those differences aren't organized in any kind of systematic way. So it's not as though there's it's not like there's one neighborhood where there's the very richly decorated houses and then there's another neighborhood. No, they're all spread out all over the place. So there's clearly some kind of social order. Otherwise it wouldn't have lasted for 1,000 years. There must have been some kind. But exactly what it was, we don't know, and it might have varied from time to time. But what I feel sure of as wrong is the inference that there was no order and that there was therefore no politics, because you will find that kind of assertion sometime. I don't think that there has ever been a time when there were no politics. And you'll find politics even among apes, right? So the idea of a kind of, sorry, that's my daughter is a bit jet lagged, so she's leaving the room. The idea that there was some golden age without politics, without social hierarchies or whatever, is definitely wrong. But exactly what it was like, we don't know.
All right. Anyone else? Well, not for the moment, it would seem. So this gives me an opening.
Okay.
You spoke at length about artistic representations, paintings, sculptures, which we traditionally associate with the notion of culture, perhaps not necessarily civilization. Maybe we associate civilization with, I don't know, the things like political modes of government or political organization or infrastructure or things like that, more like the Roman Empire. So I would like to ask you first, how do you see the relationship between culture and civilization?
Okay, that is a very important question. So I would say that there cannot be civilization without culture, but there can be culture without civilization. That the Paleolithic time clearly produced a culture that seems to have been relatively stable in a sense, or at least, if stable is not the right word, consistent. It was consistent over a very long time. And it's worth noting that we, as a species, we lived in that mode for far longer than we have in the civilized mode. And similarly, peoples whom the ancient or medieval worlds would not have regarded as civilized, like say my ancestors, the Vikings, or at one point the Anglo-Saxons, they would have been considered not civilized, but there was no question that they had culture, mythology and art and so forth. But it would have been construed, those things would have been construed as reflecting a very different outlook on life. But of course, that word culture is it's probably more closely related to an older version of the concept of civilization because that word wasn't used. But the idea of, cultivation, culture, religious cult, these things are all drawn from that idea of ideas connected with agriculture and farming and so forth. And nowadays we might be tempted to use the two sort of interchangeably. And if you say, you would probably say if you're going to the opera or to the cinema or something, you would say you're going to go take in culture. You probably wouldn't say you're going to take in civilization. But obviously the two are connected for sure.
All right. And a follow-up question, which sort of brings the discussion into the present a little bit, because your work is about connecting the past and the present. A lot of the examples you used are connected with the idea of empire. Okay, Egypt was a kingdom, but nevertheless, the empires in Mesopotamia, so on and so forth. And we have a lot of imperial legacies throughout history. The legacy of the Roman Empire, the legacy of the Persian empires, plural, there were about 5 of them. So, and of course, others more contemporary, let's say the Russian Empire, the Chinese empires. So we are, of course, unfortunately, I would say, cursed with living in very interesting times, what with all the tension and the wars and the conflicts going on. And I cannot help but notice that a lot of these tensions, a lot of these conflicts involve former empires that, in a sense, seem to suffer from what I would call imperial nostalgia. I had this discussion with my students at some point, and we did go down a bit of a rabbit hole. So, would you say that's true? Would you say that every or almost all former imperial powers aspire to some sort of renewal of that imperial glory today?
Yes and no. I mean, imperial glory is very dangerous, I think. If you think about the Germanic conquerors of the Western Roman state, a state which they wanted to perpetuate and to carry on, even in miniature, because these little kingdoms, they all wanted to sort of lay claim to that heritage. I think that the spirit was less about imperial glory, a little bit more about Roman prestige, but fundamentally about the stability of carrying things on sort of more or less the way they had always been done, which in the end produced new things. But if we were talking about, say, a kind of recreation of say, the Habsburg or the British Empire,
or the Ottoman Empire,
or the Ottoman, yeah, I mean, these would not be forces for stability. They would be violent upheavals, which would, I think, be very unlikely to succeed. But let me approach the question in another way. The ancient empires of Mesopotamia, or the sort of the city-states that grew into empires and sort of became larger, and they inherited each one from the other the sort of imperial legacy. The distinction that I would draw there is that at the time there was simply no other way to organize a state that had then been current. That was simply the way you did it. The city-states were all sort of under the linked by allegiance to a single king, and that concept of a Mesopotamian monarchy was passed on and on and on until eventually the Persians got hold of it, and then even Alexander the Great and his successors inherited that vision and passed it on to the West. So I don't want to suggest that going around conquering and pillaging is a force for stability. It certainly isn't. But in the ancient world, the vision of an international empire with a sort of single bureaucracy and a king up at the top with his sort of advisors and local rulers below him. That was just the way it was done, and the idea of even though it may have come about through bloodshed and conquest, that as it was passed on, the alternative was far worse. The absence of that order and the sort of threatening chaos, as it seemed, ensured that the sort of perpetuation of the civilization was always preferable to the alternative.
Right, I agree. And what we are witnessing now is a contestation, I believe, of the Western-led order, which has been in place since the end of World War II. And the contesting powers would be countries like Russia, China, Iran. They have a bit of an unholy alliance going on over there. So I don't think this is an accident. All of these countries used to be great empires at some point. So I cannot help but wonder if maybe this past imperial vision now animates leaders such as President Xi, President Putin, President Erdogan, or the Ayatollah in Tehran. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that undoubtedly there's an element of that. And it's hard to assess, I think, how realistic any of those beliefs actually are. And how likely they are to succeed. My view is that it would certainly be possible to, say, acknowledge and cultivate a respect for Chinese civilization without having to assert it through
Aggression.
Yeah, well, I'm hesitating between saying either aggression or simply a sort of hegemony or sort of world, a world system. I don't even know what that would look like, a sort of Confucian world system. But I think that there is a certain, if it's not necessarily imperial nostalgia, it's certainly nostalgia for a time when a more traditional mode of life prevailed, and things perhaps seemed more settled or more stable. And I can well relate to the idea that would be a powerful force, or that would be a desirable outcome. Whether present policy will achieve it or not, I am very doubtful. And I don't. I think that many of the actors that you refer to are significantly overestimating their country's capacity to achieve these outcomes. Moreover, if you compare, my field was Iran. If you compare the present Iranian government to older traditions of Iranian monarchy, I think it's fairly clear that the present idea is actually a radical departure, and that it's wrong to think of the Ayatollahs, for example, as medieval-like figures. They're not.
No, they're very modern.
Yes.
In their means and ways.
Yeah, and the concept itself of political Shiism, or of a kind of like imperial Shiism, was invented
by Khomeini.
Yeah, in the 70s.
Yeah, he came up with the idea of the government of the Islamic jurist, or vilayat-e faqih.
Yeah.
So, and he said, look, this is an idea that goes back to this Shia thinker or this other Shia thinker, which is absolutely not true.
Indeed. So I think that, yes, there is a sense of imperial nostalgia. There is a sense of civilizational pride, but what we are witnessing is more like a series of revolutionary changes, radical departures from tradition, rather than reassertions of older ideas, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. And to back up your argument about this wish to return to traditional values, let us only remember two of the most successful political slogans we've had in recent years: Make America Great Again, emphasis on again, or Take Back Control, emphasis on back, which was the slogan of the Brexit camp. So
yeah, those are good observations. I think that we'll probably see more of that in Western politics, but again, I think Brexit is a great example. It was one thing to get through the referendum, but then what was taken back?
Absolutely nothing.
That is the part that's sort of missing. Like I'm trying to be as charitable as possible. It's incomplete, as it was I would also suggest, in America. The vision of a kind of renewed, a renewed America, as you say, make America great again. I'm not really sure how successful that was.
It was successful only in creating division. If you look at the political landscape in the US right now, in the midst of this election year, it's like a horror film. You don't need to watch horror films, you just turn on the news.
Yeah, which is not to say that I oppose renewal. That's not the idea. But I think that a better, more expansive vision of, a return to sanity, stability, moderation. I think that's that just requires a little bit more thought than has recently gone into it.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the Chinese case a bit earlier on. What is going on today, I think, is an attempt on the part of revisionist powers to upset or to change the world order, not for the sake of, let's say, imposing a certain civilizational model, as was the case, let's say, with the Roman Empire. Okay, they explicitly wanted to impose a certain civilizational model. That's why they had the administration, the infrastructure, so on and so forth. This is not about imposing the Chinese civilization or the Russian model or the Iranian model. This is about power. Who has power, who wants power, and who wants to change the existing order. It's about hegemony, not about civilization, I would argue. Would you agree?
Yeah, to an extent. I mean, there's a chapter on China in my book in which I approach this from a slightly different angle. There is in China, or at least they want to portray in China, a Confucian revival. And there is a revival insofar as traditional Chinese religions and ancestral customs are no longer persecuted, they're no longer illegal, they're actively encouraged. But they're also tied up with a surveillance state, a very cynical, officially atheist and materialist government. Confucian ideals seem to be co-opted in some cases as a method of social control. And, I'm kind of ambivalent about, it's kind of hard to determine how one feels about that, because it's good to think that the Chinese government is no longer fundamentally opposed to its civilization, to Chinese civilization, that there has been some kind of development there. But is it genuine? Is it honest? Is it anything more than a cynical power move, or yet another tool of control and an exertion of state power? That, I think it's sometimes hard to tell. But again, on the other hand, in the West, we still seem to struggle with this idea that we can or we should find meaning in the past or in our own traditions, and especially with the idea that the government, or at least elites, could encourage that kind of thing. It seems as a considerable ideological challenge to us to be confronted with an opponent or a competitor that wants to look deeper into its own past, its own heritage, and find some form of strength in it, even if it's ultimately negative. That seems very threatening, I think, in a way. And in the West, we should at least be able to talk about our own past more favorably than we do. I think a broad I think abroad there's perhaps not enough self-criticism. In the West, there is far too much.
Exactly. And this leads to exaggeration and radicalism, and to a rewriting of history to such an extent that what are supposed to be lessons from history become, well, less important, less significant. If you bring down all the statues of people who did questionable things in the past, instead of explaining why those things were questionable and wrong, how can history still serve as a lesson and a warning? If you just brush everything under the carpet and endlessly apologize and endlessly rewrite the past, in a sense, we no longer live in reality, we live in an Orwellian dystopia. And that is just not healthy, I believe.
Yeah, there's a particularly silly example from my own country. There's a long street called Dundas Street, which of course no one has heard of. It's a completely unremarkable street, but it was named after a man who it was believed was not quite enthusiastically opposed. He was not sufficiently enthusiastically opposed to slavery. He was opposed to it, but he didn't move quite fast enough. And, you know, I just think, first of all, no one's heard of this guy. No one had heard of him until this got going. And, you know, he was still on the right side of things, but, you know, he wasn't aggressive enough or something. You know, it just seems kind of like a desperate move to make a really pointless issue out of nothing. But of course, things are much more tense about other figures in other countries. I'm not sure what anybody gets out of this, apart from, as you allude, a kind of assertion of power over others. And it's not even really control over the past, as some people think. I think it's more just obliterating it to make it forgotten and insignificant, which again serves the interests of radical elements who want to see more aggressive change, or who simply want to antagonize people that they think are kind of entrenched elite or what have you. I don't think that we're going to get anything out of this apart from more confusion and anger. Attitudes to historical figures, like this seems very banal, but it needs to be said. Attitudes to historical figures change. I mean, and in one particular culture, one figure may be widely loathed, but he's widely respected in another one. If you think of ultimately, you know, the issue of something like colonialism, I mean, Great Britain is now considered a sort of horrible culprit for colonialism. Great Britain was a colony of the Roman Empire twice. It was conquered by the Romans twice. It was then conquered by the Normans. It was invaded 100 times by all sorts of by the Vikings. You know, and I'm sort of in danger of rambling at this point. But the one of the potential lessons to take from that is that despite those occurrences, which were undoubtedly horrible, and we have historical records that would attest to that, that there were still figures like the Venerable Bede or other people who were able to take this huge mess of nations and peoples and languages, and through history actually make it all into something, to unify it into a single narrative, which you can still go and read. It's not bad reading, and make sense of it. And I think that that's more of the instinct or impulse that we at this time would benefit from.
Exactly. We need to understand what was wrong with the figures of the past and the actions of the past, while also acknowledging that, people contain multitudes. Okay, I hear there's a lot of backlash now against Thomas Jefferson. Yes, he was a slave owner, but does this negate everything else that he did good? I think not. The two things can coexist. Picasso was a horrible human being, but an amazing artist. So the two things can coexist. People contain multitudes.
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes think that the motive is just simply to humiliate and embarrass what for a long time was construed as a dominant culture.
And you cannot apply today's standards to people and events in the past. That is very dangerous. It takes you down a very bizarre path. Okay, imagine maybe 5,000 years from now, others will sit in judgment of us for our actions, values, beliefs through the lens of their time.
Oh, they will. But that, again, that shows, like, apart from just appalling arrogance, it also shows a very bizarre ignorance of history not just as a set of facts, but as a concept that, we haven't reached the end of it. It's going to keep going, whether you like it or not, and things that you take for granted will not, they may end up actually being totally forgotten or having no influence on anything. The ideas that are important to you may cease to be important in some other time, and what you value may be considered very odd or detrimental. But it's just profoundly strange, I think, that isn't better understood as a concept.
It is. We do live in strange times indeed. So, as a closing thought, why should we still care about civilization? Why does it still matter?
Okay, well, short answer is that it is a concept, an ideal, an aspiration that brings out brings out our full humanity. It fully develops it. It allows us to exercise all faculties at once, I would argue. Long answer is that still within living memory of some people, our worlds collapsed in the middle of the 20th century. And I think that, especially across the Atlantic, it's easily forgotten how horrific that was. I'm obviously referring to the two world wars. And then, of course, after it, half of Europe was occupied until I was about 10. And I remember when the wall came down. These memories are still vivid, and my grandparents, who are no longer alive, they fought in the last war, and for me growing up, this was still practically a current event. Could hardly eat dinner with my grandfather both grandfathers, without hearing about the war. And the lesson there is that what I'm calling civilization and the stability that human flourishing requires in the sense of permanence and rootedness was very badly disrupted, and perhaps we haven't yet fully recovered. And you cannot read a newspaper or look at the news from day to day without being reminded that there is still, at least in the minds of some people, a great deal of unfinished business arising from the upheavals of the 20th century. And so it is a reminder, if I had to put it sort of abstractly, it is a reminder of how easy it is for civilization to fall apart, to be lost. and how hard it is to maintain it. And the alternative to maintaining it, the consequences of not maintaining it, I think we know from experience, or from memory at least, that they are very, very bad indeed. And let's not let it happen again. Let's try to keep the flame going a little bit longer if we can.
Exactly, I could not agree more. The same is true of democracy, okay? Democracy does not just maintain itself. It takes struggle, it takes commitment, it takes dedication. So hopefully we have provided you with a thought-provoking discussion. Maybe we gave you a few things to think about. I would like to thank you all for coming here and listening to us. And a big, big thanks to Dr. Bonner. You have been a wonderful speaker, a wonderful interlocutor, and I couldn't be happier to spend an evening here in this excellent company.
Thanks for
thank
having
you
me.
all.